Well, hello everybody, and welcome to the Place to Soar, where our motto is step out and redesign, and the focus is always on you. I'm your host, Anita Russell, and I'm very happy to have this distinguished gentleman with me today. I reached out to him because one of the things that we're going to talk about, I actually interviewed someone else on the same topic, and I wanted to kind of have the opportunity to interview him as sort of that Pittsburgh perspective, if you will. So this gentleman here is Dean John Welch, and he is the Dean for Student Services and Community Engagement of students at the Pittsburgh Theological Seminary, and he's been in that role since 2007. He's a PhD in Healthcare Ethics from Duquesne University, a Master of Divinity from the Pittsburgh Theological Seminary, a certificate in Urban Ministry also from the Pittsburgh Theological Seminary. He got his Bachelor of Science degree in Chemical Engineering and Economics from Carnegie Mellon. So I'm just going to jump right in, and I'm going to start by asking you what I ask all of my guests. Out of all of the SOAR values that I have 10 SOAR values, and I usually have my guests take a look at that list and then pick the two that really resonate with them, and then we have a conversation from there. So the two that you selected are managing relationships and community and family. So if you could share with our audience why you selected those two values.
Oh, sure. Well, thanks. First of all, thanks for having me on the show.
You're welcome.
Relationships are extremely important. As we talk about community, you can't have a community without relationships. But you never know when you meet someone when you're going to be needed to help them or when they'll be needed to help you. But it's not just for utility purposes like that. It's there's always the importance of using those relationships or being a part of relationships that really can enhance community or enhance opportunities. And so what I found out over the years was just by being in community and then being in relationships where different people put me on a path that I didn't anticipate I was going to be on. And so it's not like I went and formed these relationships for the sake of making sure I got to where I wanted to be.
Okay.
But it turned out that by being in those relationships enabled me to be where I am.
That's excellent.
And so the second value, which one was that again? That was
community. So community and family, managing relationships. You just talked about. So community and family.
Yeah. So community and family. Well, family is important. And I say God first. Family second.
Absolutely.
And work just somewhere. Somewhere work comes in.
It fits in there somewhere.
Yeah, you got to get paid, but it doesn't take over family and God.
Right,
so,
right.
But family is a microcosm of community, and I think as you look at today's society, one of the reasons why we don't have communities is because we really don't have family like we used to. What we have are neighborhoods, and we have people living, cohabitating in places where I think the values that we grew up with that were instilled in us as we were young kids are not transferred like they once were. So for me, building the family will enable us to really build strong communities, and as opposed to just living in sort of a cohabitation kind of model.
Yes.
And then living in neighborhoods, because neighborhoods people don't know each other, community people do.
Yeah,
they come out and they talk and they share and they talk across fences and they visit each other. We're not in that space anymore.
That's a nice way of distinguishing it, though, when you talk about a neighborhood versus a community. That's a really nice way of distinguishing it. So you're also the pastor of a church over on the north side, so can you talk about your pastorship a little bit?
Yeah, I used to be the pastor.
Oh, okay.
My wife is the pastor there.
Oh,
so
okay.
When I transitioned over here to take this position, she took my position at the church.
Oh, okay.
So, but I'm still there supporting her. She will say that I'm still the pastor in the eyes of some
Other
folks.
people.
And where that might be true, but I try to give her space and let her lead, and I'll defer everything there to her. But I still do the Bible studies there, and for a while I was the minister of music until we hired another person to come in and do that. So I'm still very much involved.
Oh, excellent, excellent. One of the things, because I visited your church that one time when you had the program in the evening,
Right.
and one of the things that I love about going to different churches is the feel that I get when I get there. So when I came to your church, I felt very much at home. I had the chance to I met Lisa, the event coordinator here, and all of that, and she's a very welcoming and very loving kind of person. And so when I came to your church, I felt like I fit right in like a glove.
Well, that's what we want.
Yeah, it was a really, really good visit. So part of the reason why I wanted to interview you is because I had shared with you that I had done an interview not even a year ago, about 9 months ago or so, with one of the officers from the Trenton Police Department. He's a juvenile officer. He's a really, really good friend of mine. And I had him come on because one of the things that I'm really interested in from that community perspective, so it's the community perspective, but it's also sort of that some of the social dynamics and all of that as they relate to the police department. And so I'm really kind of intrigued by this idea of community policing.
Sure.
And so when I had my friend come on, we had a conversation. He was actually on the show, and then I had 2 guests who were chaplains from the police chaplaincy program in the city of Trenton. So I'm really intrigued by that whole concept, given, sort of the backdrop of some of the things that are happening across the country with, some of the relationships. You talked about relationships. Some of those relationships that are there between the police officers and the community members. So, and you were the chief chaplain at one time. So can you talk to our audience a little bit about how that happened, how you ended up being in that role?
Yeah, so that's another one of those situations where relationships put me somewhere where I didn't anticipate being.
Okay.
I met the then police chief who he knew of me through my activism work, because I also heavily involved in faith-based community organizing. And he had one of his chaplains then reach out to me to see if I would be a part, because when he became chief, he wanted to sort of revamp the police chaplaincy program.
Okay.
So I agreed to come on board, and due to some unfortunate incidents, the person he had there originally was dismissed, and so he asked me to head up the chaplaincy program, which I did. But one of the things he was really important to him was not only for us as chaplains to support the men and women in blue and their families, but also to be there to support people in the communities when necessary.
Yes.
And so, it was a way for us to support the community, but community policing had not necessarily taken off. Again, community policing, before it was called community policing, was what police officers did. They walked
back
the beat.
in the day, exactly.
They walked the beat.
Exactly.
They talked to kids. They talked to folks,
Yeah.
and you knew who the officers were. They went into schools. We had officer friendly, etc. And then they sort of got away from that model. And I think what sort of accelerated the detachment was the whole law and order modality that Reagan and others put out. And so there was this over-policing, there was the over-criminalizing of people that had drugs and things like that. And so the forming of relationships kind of faded away when it comes to police officers and folks in the community. And as I spoke with some officers, they who had been on the force for a long time, they remember the days when they would walk the beat and talk to people and have relationships with them. And so community policing is really about getting back to that, even having what they call sort of like extension of the zones, police zones. So they'll have an office like in a neighborhood, a little small office in a neighborhood as a way to sort of get closer to people in the communities.
Okay.
But it's something that we really have to get back to. But at the same time, what stands in the way of that is the unfair characterization of African Americans by police officers. And here in Pittsburgh, they started implementing the implicit bias training within the academy to sort of eradicate the false notion that all blacks are dangerous and predisposed to violence and this sort of thing, which lended itself to over-policing. But one of the things many people don't realize is that policing in this country evolved from the appointing of former indentured servants, white indentured servants who were released after the 7 years and given a bushel of corn and a gun. Some of them were put on slave patrol, and that's how policing started. And so that whole mentality, towards African Americans never really faded away over time.
Yes.
And so once it came in with this whole idea of law and order and the imposing of and depositing of drugs in the inner city neighborhoods, it sort of lended itself to what we've seen as what's considered mass incarceration, and now what we now have is mass supervision, where people are making money off of putting us in prison, but also making money on us coming out of prison too. So, long answer to your question.
Yeah, but it's a really good answer, and there's a lot of information that's packed in that. So maybe we could unpack some of that information just a little bit. So as you were in this position and you were able to interact with the police officers, I'm assuming that you had the opportunity from time to time to just have some real conversations with them. Like you mentioned that there were some officers that really remember the old days, so to speak, and how it was they had more of a community presence. And so when you think about younger officers, those are now coming into the ranks now where that wasn't necessarily their experience. So can you comment a little bit about sort of those who remember the old days and those who that's not even on their radar screen, so to speak?
Yeah, so it's really the responsibility of the command staff, of your commanders and your sergeants and lieutenants. The chief has his or her responsibilities, but the folks who are on the ground, the commanders in the zones, and the lieutenants and sergeants are the ones that to make sure that those new recruits who are coming in are being integrated into a practice that makes sense to build trust within the community. Truth of the matter is, not everybody wants to buy into that.
Yes,
and in all honesty, Pittsburgh has always been a racist city, and the fact FOP, we're lodge number 1, so we were one of the first police unions in the country, and so there's a sort of attitude that is permeated within the police lodge that is still very discriminatory and very prejudiced, and so there are some who, and truthfully now in the age of our current president, where white supremacy just seems to be able to raise its head, without impunity. There is a sense of I don't want to say privilege, but there's a sense that some folks feel that they can do and say what they want.
Yes.
That includes police officers, and I think we've seen some reports where there was this one, was he a Coast Guard? Somebody who was in the armed services who had stockpiled all of this weaponry and was going to do some mass right, and so he was arrested, then he had to be released because they couldn't put charges on him, couldn't charge him with anything. And so, we'd be naive to think that there aren't elements of that even within our police force ranks. And so we recognize that still may exist here, or still exists here in our own city, this element of corruption within policing. And so our current mayor had hired a police chief who was for the sole purpose of coming in to do reform, to sort of change the attitude and change the culture. This gentleman had experience in implicit bias training, had experience in restorative justice practices, and he came in and basically was run out of town because the rank and file didn't want to change. And one reason why I ran for mayor is because the current mayor didn't stick up for him. So it's you have to understand kind of like the environment that you're in, and for the younger officers. So what I did want to mention also is what makes Pittsburgh different too, is that it was one of the first cities in the country to go under federal consent decree because of abuse of police power. And so because of that, the federal government required the city of Pittsburgh in the recruiting to diversify the recruiting class. So you'd have one African American woman, one African American male, one white woman, one white male. And over a period of time, Pittsburgh had such a diverse force that there were more women in Pittsburgh police officers, in the Pittsburgh police force, than any city across the country.
Oh, okay.
But when the consent decree was lifted, they went back to old tactics of hiring practices that shut out African Americans. So if you look at Pittsburgh's force today, there's a decent number of African Americans still that have over 20 years of service, 25 and some up to 30, that can retire. And if that wave retires, we would have probably a police force that may have less than 5% African Americans on it. So
because they're not filling in the ranks.
Because they're not filling it in the ranks the way they were supposed to under court order. So so there's a culture of policing, and I say there's a difference between law enforcement and policing. Policing
Can
is
you
a culture.
explain that? Yeah.
Well, law enforcement is a requirement. You uphold the laws that are on the books. How you do that is called policing.
Got it.
And so your attitude that goes with upholding the laws determines how you police. So you can over police, you can under police. You can police in a fair manner, you can police in a discriminatory manner, and so we've seen the unfair policing, the imbalance, the prejudicial policing taking place with the shooting of the young man in Cleveland. I'm blanking on his name now. The 13-year-old kid. Tamir Rice, right? The same thing and even though Trayvon Martin wasn't killed by a police officer, it was somebody who sort of had a policing mentality,
Yes.
right?
Yes.
And so the list goes on, even with the brother who was killed in Ferguson, Michael Brown, where the officer described him as this big,
Yes.
and so that kind of caricature is something that has been pervasive within police culture. So, they say it's easier to create a new culture than it is to change an existing one. And so, recognize that it takes time.
Yeah, those are some really, really good points. And getting back to the issue of reform, given what you just said with the older officers who have that sort of like 20 or plus years veterans, and they're going to be moving on, is there any recognition within the leadership that this is coming down the pike, and are they trying to at least address it, or are they just kind of going to let it just sort of naturally happen, if you will?
Yeah, there has to be some level of intentionality for sure. And so the former police chief who introduced the implicit bias training, that's still going on now. That's going on under the auspices of one of the commanders in the city who was promoted by that former police chief. And but it's one thing to be trained and to be informed. It's another thing to really act on the new information you have. Yes. So you can put this training in place and just check off the box. And people can go through this training because they're mandated to do it, but it won't guarantee the behavior will change. So there are some efforts in place. To how successful it is, I think, is yet to be determined. But I will give the commander here in East Liberty, Zone 5, I'll give him a lot of credit for the things that he has been doing to really reach out and be present in the community, to have events and invite the community to come down to the zone. And so there are some efforts. It may not be universally applied or implemented, but they're doing some work in that area.
So let's shift the conversation a little bit and talk about when you were in that role. Like, what were some of your experiences personally in being in the role of the chief chaplain?
So, there were some officers who I had good relationships with, and there were some who I did not have good relationships with. And reasons why the relationship wasn't good, for reasons I mentioned before, is, there was clearly some racial prejudice. And I'm one of those individuals where I'm outspoken, and I'm not afraid to confront things that I see need to be addressed. And so some of them didn't like the fact that I spoke out against some of the things that I saw, which I won't necessarily go into right now, but it just spoke to the racial tensions and bias that existed within the police department. And so, but the good relationships I had enabled me to respond to some situations that were critical. So when I mentioned earlier that we were called to respond to not only police issues but also community issues, I've had my chaplains. I was called, and my chaplains were deployed to respond to the flooding Washington Boulevard, where a couple of people were killed, got swept into the drain. We were called to Western Psych when a shooter came in, sniper came in and killed some folks. And so we were called to respond to the downtown at the Gateway Towers, where there was a guy holding some folks hostage in an office building, in an office unit there. And And so some of my chaplains were with the family of the folks held hostage, and some of my chaplains were with the family of the guy who was the actor.
Okay.
Then we were called to a situation where two young kids, they might have been 3 and 5 years old, were caught up in a house fire and ended up dying. And so we had to show up at the hospital to be there to receive the family when they would receive the news that children had expired. And then help them in making the funeral arrangements as well. So those are some things that we were able to do, and I did under my leadership. And every year we would sort of visit all of the zones and deliver cookies around Christmas time. And right after we had the shootings, before you came back to Pittsburgh in 2009, 3 of our police officers were ambushed in Stanton Heights. They went to respond to a domestic situation. 2 did respond to a domestic situation early Saturday morning, and was greeted at the door by gunfire. And those were 2 white police officers. And then a 3rd police officer who was just got off duty happened to live around the corner from the incident, dropped his daughter off, went to the scene, and as soon as he got out of his car, he was shot. And because those who tried to get to him didn't know where the shots were coming from or when they would, how they could protect themselves, he ended up bleeding out. So, and so as a result of that situation, we did triage. We went to Stanton Heights and had a community day where we allowed people to sort of speak out about their trauma, because it wasn't just the officers who were there that were affected by that. It was the people who lived in that area too, who weren't used to hearing gunshots, who weren't used to seeing activity like that on the street. And so they had to live within that trauma. So our chaplains organized a community event that allowed them to speak with responders and mental health folks. And so those were some of the things that we were able to do under my tenure, and I'm happy to have passed it off to another individual who doesn't look like me, and he seems to be having better success than I did. So.
Okay. So from a community perspective, how does the community respond to, like, for example, the presence of the chaplains, knowing that they're a part of the police chaplaincy program?
Well, that was one of the challenges that I had during my whole 10 years. One was getting us recognized within the Bureau was a challenge, and not as successful as I would have liked for it to be. And 2, getting us known in the community was not all that successful and all of that sort of stuff.
Yeah, it's interesting you said that, because when I had the conversation with the officer and the 2 chaplains from the city of Trenton, it's kind of a different scenario. It's a little bit more known in the community that this program exists. So, for example, the gentleman who's the police officer, his name is Officer Davis. He is an officer, but he's also involved in his church. So he's a deacon in the church. So he kind of wears both sides of that, And one of the things that they did was really describe the training and everything that they go through. And so in the city of Trenton, there's like a very good contingent of people from the clergy who are participating in this program. And they, described a couple of incidents where it was very impactful having them there on the scene of a situation and things like that. So, and being focused on, but one of the things that they stressed is that they are focused on the community. And especially if it's like a violent situation that's going on, that they try to keep the community, especially if it's like family members, you know what I mean? Dealing with family members and all of that. They're there to like console them and comfort them. But they also drew the point that they're also there for the officers. When the officers kind of go through some stuff. I mean, they have traumatic jobs as well. And or traumatic experiences because of their job and everything as well, but they recognize both sides of it, and so their job is to sort of minister, if you will, to both sides of that. So
it's first responders have a very difficult job, whether it's EMS, whether it's fire, whether it's police. I mean, they respond to some pretty horrific situations,
Yes.
and which can be traumatic, and truthfully, they don't all get the care that they need to get. And so many of them are carrying guns or responding to situations with PTSD unaddressed, and which is not fair to them. It's not fair to their partners too. And so the health and well-being of police officers, first responders in general, is very important. And so, my background is in healthcare, as you mentioned. And so I when I go into the hospitals where I'm talking to medical staff, I will tell them, you might want to, cut corners and increase your profits by just pulling in Father so-and-so, Reverend so-and-so off the street to be a chaplain for your hospital. But if they haven't gone through clinical pastoral education, then they're not trained to be involved in situations involving critical incidences as far as healthcare, and they can do more harm than good. So there's a special training for hospital chaplains, there's a special training for police chaplains. And so what I did when I put together my team of chaplains, one of the things I wanted to look for was anyone who was in ministry that had former law enforcement experience, because that person would understand what policing is about, and also they would help bridge the trust between us and the officers. If you had military chaplaincy experience, I would bring them in. But if you had none of those two things, there were some classes you had to take. So there's the Citizens Police Academy that the city of Pittsburgh has.
Oh, okay.
I would make the chaplains go through that. We also have CIT classes, which is crisis intervention training. And CIT classes are for officers particularly to help them de-escalate a situation if an actor has a mental illness. So rather than just shooting somebody who's acting crazy, understand what it is that, maybe they have a mental illness, and sort of de-escalate the situation and treat them and not incarcerate them, or send them to treatment and not incarceration. And so I had my chaplains go through that. And the other one is critical incident stress management, where you recognize the fact that people are going to go through traumatic cycles, that, a stressful or traumatic situation can have some emotional effects on you, and you may not feel it the moment that you expect that the situation happens. It may come on you 5 days, 5 weeks, 5 months later, but understand what it is and what the source of it is, and how do you manage that. So and it can follow you for the rest of your life. And so we talk about people coming back from battle that are in the military, the PTSD they have, and the situations they're involved in are on a more acute level. But and it happens probably over a more intense period of time. But for police officers, it can happen over a longer period of time. But sometimes it just takes one incident that can evoke some trauma within you.
So I think we're just about out of time. So I wanted to ask one final question. If somebody out there who is listening to this is kind of thinking that they might want to be involved in the police chaplaincy program, how would they go about doing that?
Well, they could contact our police liaison. That's Detective Patty Poloka, who's with Pittsburgh Police. They could always contact the police command or police chief, and he could then make the referral. Our head chaplain right now is Reverend Michael Roach, and so those were 3 ways in which they could certainly make contact if they have any interest. One of the requirements is that you should be ordained by adjudicatory, in some sort of ministry.
Yes.
And secondly, that you have somebody who would be a reference for you. So,
excellent.
But yeah, that's how you can get in.
Excellent. Well, thank you, Dean Welch. I certainly do appreciate you being here for this episode of The Place to SOAR. So to the audience, I want to thank you for joining us. This is Anita Russell signing off, and I thank you, and I'll see you next time.